Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on written IRB procedures, how to comply with Office for Human Research Protections requirements. Thank you for joining us today for this presentation from the Collaborative Research Center for American Indian Health, also known as CRCAIH. My name is Jyoti Angle, and I'm the Director for the Regulatory Knowledge Core for CRCAIH. The focus of the Regulatory Knowledge Core is to work with our tribal partners to build research infrastructure and develop a systematic research review process. We also provide support to participating investigators and communities to help navigate research regulations. And we accomplish this through trainings, education, and providing tools and resources. A couple of quick reminders before we go ahead. This presentation is being recorded for future use, and the slides will be available on our website for future reference at www.crcaiih.org. Also, currently we have everyone on mute. We will hold questions until the end, but feel free to type in your questions into the text box at any time. Over the next hour, we will review and outline OHRP requirements for written institutional review board procedures and review the current OHRP guidance on written IRB procedures. The goal for this presentation is to provide a basic understanding of the HHS requirements for written IRB procedures. The use of the word must in OHRP guidance means that something is required under the 45 CFR 46. The word should in OHRP guidance means that something is recommended or suggested but not required. An institution may use an alternative approach if the approach satisfies the requirements. In the event you have questions or difficulty interpreting or the use of the guidance, OHRP also recommends that you call them for assistance. I have personally called them a few times and have always received prompt response and found them very useful. So the Regulatory Knowledge Core has focus areas. Our goal is to develop tribal research infrastructure, provide education and training, regulatory support, and consultation services. The majority of our services are driven by tribal needs, and this training is part of our training curriculum on regulatory services. So some general considerations about IRB policies. The OHRP guidance that we are going to review today covers federally funded research. However, institutions submitting an FWA or a federal-wide assurance application can choose to follow federal guidelines for all research, including that is not federally funded. We do have a training module on federal-wide assurance on our CRCAIH website if you would like to review that. Why are policies important? IRB policies are important because they reflect how IRBs address regulations and review documentation in a timely manner. OHRP has not developed a model for written IRB procedures document for institutions because procedures can vary based on the size and type of institution. But OHRP does recommend that IRB policies provide sufficient step-by-step detail so that an independent observer, which could be a researcher or an auditor from OHRP, can understand how the IRB operates. A common question that we have got is, how do federal regulations affect tribal policies? Federal regulations are the minimum requirements for institutions or tribes that receive federal funding. Tribes and other institutions can choose to have more restrictive policies to provide community protection and exertion of tribal sovereignty. OHRP conducts evaluations to determine compliance with these regulations and issues what is called as determination letters if there is evidence of non-compliance. These letters are available on the HHS website and are useful in understanding situations in which IRBs might be in non-compliance with regulations. Here's the link to the website, and it has letters going back to 2000. And if you review these, it provides interesting information on situations in which institutions may find themselves non-compliant. Regulations also state that ultimately the institution official is responsible for policies and procedures, but this task can be delegated to someone else, which is typically like an IRB director or administrator, who is responsible for reviewing and drafting IRB policies. Internal IRB policies should also agree with those of a greater institution. For example, IRB policies need to align with tribal constitutional law. Specifically, and also should specify tribal government authority and role in IRB operations. For example, IRB policies need to consider whether tribal law requires open or closed meetings. If tribal law requires open meetings, IRB policy should address this requirement and include any exceptions such as meetings convened to review non-compliance or unanticipated problems. So who should have access to IRB policies? These policies should be accessible to everyone. This can be done by posting them on the institution's website or providing them to the investigator upon request. How often should policies be updated? This is really up to the institution, but it is always good to review and revisit policies to make sure that they align with the current OHRP requirements. And investigators should make themselves familiar with their institutional IRB policies. So let's move on to our main topic for today, the OHRP required elements. So here is on this slide is a summary of the OHRP requirements for written procedures. They're not intended to be in any specific order. So OHRP requires that the policies include detailed description for conducting initial and continuing review, reporting the findings and actions to investigators and institutions, to determine which procedures require more often than annual review, identify which projects need verification from sources other than the investigator that no changes have occurred since the last review, ensure that prompt reporting to the IRB happens when there's changes, and also ensure that such changes may not be initiated without IRB approval letter. Finally, it requires prompt reporting to the IRB, the institutional official, and any department head or OHRP for unanticipated problems, serious or continuing non-compliance, and suspension and termination of IRB approval. So the OHRP guidance goes into details on how these requirements can be operationalized and included in a policy. So when you are drafting a policy for initial and continuing review, you want to make sure that you include the description of how the primary review system will work for an initial review, a continuing review, amendment, or unanticipated problem. The policy should outline what is the information required for submission from the investigators, list the specific documents provided to the reviewers, the amount of time members will have to review information prior to IRB meetings, what is the range of possible actions that can be taken, what are the procedures when expedited review is conducted, and how that review could be communicated to all IRB members. Typically, when an expedited review happens, it is communicated to all members during the next convened meeting. What are the quorum requirements for an IRB meeting? This is where you would include requirements about IRB membership, specifically including members from each category, including non-scientist and a non-affiliated member. You would also be able to describe issues regarding conflict of interest. And finally, the policies should describe the criteria for approval. In the event of continuing review, the policy should state how many days in advance the materials must be submitted by the investigator to allow sufficient time for review by the IRB before the expiration of the current approval. So the next required element pertains to reporting findings and actions to investigators and institutions. The IRB needs to submit letters of approval to investigators in a timely manner. Delays in approval letters may affect projects that need review from multiple IRBs, where approval from one IRB is contingent on approval from another IRB. Although there is no requirement for the time frame within which approval letters should be sent, it can be helpful to include a timeline for completing IRB review. In the event of disapprovals of protocol, description should be included in the policy of which institutional office or official will be notified and how the notification will occur. If applicable, you should also include which official is responsible for further review of an approved protocol. In the event of disapproval, the policy should also outline how investigators will be notified and allowed to respond in person or in writing and appeal the decision. In the event of suspensions and terminations, detailed guidelines should be provided on the timeline for notification of various agencies. So here's a question, and the next slide will have the answer for that. Can any of the following entities approve a research disapproved by an IRB? The institutional official, the IRB office, the convened IRB, or the convened IRB and the institutional official. So which of these, if any, can approve a research disapproved by an IRB? And here's the response. So only a convened IRB can overturn a disapproval of a research project. A project that has not been approved by an IRB cannot be approved by any other entity. So another one. So the IRB voted to disapprove a research project. What must be included in the IRB letter to the investigator? Reason for disapproval, modifications required to secure approval, number of votes for, against, and number of members abstaining, and a statement that the investigator can respond in writing or in person. Again, the question says what must be included. And these are the 3 items that must be included in the approval in the letter that is sent to the investigator. Moving on, the policies and procedures also need to determine which procedures require review more often than an annual review. Now this could be for protocols with a high risk to potential benefit ratio, or this could be for high-risk protocols such as phase 1 clinical trials, which typically involve healthy volunteers and are conducted to understand the pharmacodynamics and determine drug safety. Also, the policy can identify ways in which investigators with repeated history of non-compliance could have their protocols subjected to more than frequent annual review. Which projects need verification from sources other than the investigator that no material changes have occurred since last review? So the policy should include specific criteria for identifying such projects, and the suggested guidelines for those are randomly selected projects, complex projects involving unusual levels or types of risks to subjects, investigators with history of non-compliance, or information provided in continuation review that might cause a concern or raise a red flag. So for example, if a consent form is submitted and is the wrong version from which was approved, that might prompt verification from sources other than the investigator that no changes have occurred. So how does the IRB ensure prompt reporting of changes, and such changes are approved may not be initiated without IRB review? One of the common ways that this is done is to include language in the approval letter that informs investigators that changes may not be initiated without IRB approval. Continuing review form should include a question about changes to research since last approval. You could also have the investigator sign an assurance statement indicating that he or she will not initiate changes without IRB approval. There is one instance where IRB changes might be initiated without IRB approval, and that can be done only to eliminate immediate subject harm. The next criteria pertains to reporting unanticipated problems. How does the IRB ensure prompt reporting of unanticipated problems and serious and non-continuing events, suspensions, and terminations? What is the time frame for reporting, and what is the range of possible actions taken by the IRB in response to the above reports? The OHRP also recommends IRB documentation and record keeping. It recommends that minutes should reflect discussion regarding risk determination and approval period. Should document separate deliberations and actions for each protocol review. Minutes must be taken carefully to include number of members who voted for, against, and abstained, a summary of discussion of controverted issues and their resolutions, and reasons for requesting modifications to the protocol. OHRP has consistently emphasized over the years the importance of creating written records of IRB meetings in its letters to institutions. So if you are an IRB coordinator and are responsible for taking minutes, you should ensure that the IRB provides you with protocol-specific information for each finding. For example, if the IRB is reviewing a request for waiver to obtain consent, it is required to provide specific justification for why it is not practical to conduct research without this waiver, why the research is no more than minimal risk, and how the waiver will not affect the rights and welfare of the subjects. If this documentation is absent in an audit, the IRB might be held non-compliant. Also, the minutes should be written impersonally, meaning that the minutes should not attribute opinions to individual members. It is recommended that IRBs use a template for recording minutes. Although I did not find a minutes template, the NIH website has some good guidelines on recording IRB minutes, the NIH IRB website. I'm hoping I can pull it up here. Okay, looks like it won't work. If you're using an IRB management software, these softwares typically have templates for minutes as well. So examples of types of information you can include in minutes is location and time meeting was convened and adjourned, initial and continuing presence of quorum, when a member leaves the room or the meeting, and when a member cannot attend in person but provides written reviews. Something to keep in mind is that these minutes are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So although IRB minutes are typically not made public, they can be subject to this act. Additional guidance on including information in the policies and procedures is regarding activities requiring IRB review. What happens if there's failure to comply with IRB review? And who can determine whether an activity requires IRB review? This section has major implications on tribal IRBs, which are often tasked with reviewing all research, not just human subjects research. The IRB policy in this instance should specify types of research that needs to be submitted for review. For example, ethnographic research, which is designed to explore cultural phenomena, and researcher collects data through observing people. The IRB also needs to keep records and documentation of protocol information, including data safety monitoring board information, audit reports, and participant complaints. The policy should also include procedures for expedited review and must clearly define a major and minor amendment. So major amendments are usually amendments pertaining to adding a drug or changing a drug or procedures that might increase risk or adding invasive procedures. Minor amendments are those that include adding a life events questionnaire or increasing the target enrollment numbers. The OHRP further gives miscellaneous guidance on procedures for determining exemptions. Written procedures also should describe applicable state laws and local laws. The IRB should be aware of which state laws would be pertinent to IRB review and include those in the policies. Procedures for selecting and appointing IRB chairperson and members. Procedures for training and educating IRB members and staff. A description of the required elements of informed consent and criteria for waiving or altering these requirements, and procedures for ensuring that the IRB possesses sufficient knowledge of the local research context. In summary, OHRP requirements are the minimal requirements that you need to follow if you have federally funded research. Institutions, however, can choose to have more restrictive policies. Local and state laws also apply. Investigators and other staff should have access to IRB policies, and institutions must follow their own policies at all times. At this point, I'd like to open up the forum for any questions. Please go ahead and type